Hi class, my name is Karen Brantley. 2020 marked the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. The right for women to vote was not freely given to us, it was something that had to be fought for. The suffragettes that fought for the right to vote had to use the 5 pillars of the First Amendment. Those pillars are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and freedom to petition the government. In 1867, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, some Americans believed that a radical reconstructing of the country could take place. Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony were critical to the founding of the American Equal Rights Association, the AERA, which had the goal of securing universal suffrage voting rights for all Americans. As the campaign went on, the wealthy white men who funded it grew to believe that only black men getting the right to vote, not women, was politically viable. There was the notion, why did women need to vote? Their husbands could vote and represent them. The lack of support in the AERA led Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to find outside funding. This information all came from the Agitators podcast, which I highly recommend anybody who is interested in the life of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass and their relationship together to work for equal rights for all. The suffragettes used their freedom of speech to spread their message for women's rights. In the Agitators podcast, they recall a conversation between Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony. Susan said, "What can I do?" Frederick said, "Agitate, agitate, agitate." Susan responded, "Agitation alone is not enough." And Frederick then said, "Agitation is the spark to the fire of all change." And this is why the First Amendment is so much more important than just freedom of speech, which is one of the only pillars of the First Amendment that most people remember. Freedom of assembly became a very important part of the suffragists fighting for equal rights. In the book Suffrage, The Epic Struggle for Women's Right to Vote, it talks about how large social clubs, whose memberships numbered in hundreds, sometimes thousands, trained women how to organize, project a public voice, and pressure the political system. This was a necessary step in the evolution of women and an unconscious protest against the isolation in which women have dwelt in the past, a reaching out after a larger and fuller life, and a desire to keep in touch with women who were thinking and acting independently. Being in a community with other like-minded women and getting together to strategize to make change was so important. One person alone can hardly make a change. A group is another thing. You might look at the women's suffrage movement and think that the freedom of a religion wouldn't play a big part, but it did. Susan B. Anthony was religious and would speak out about that regularly. But freedom of religion is also freedom from religion. And Elizabeth Stanton pulled away from religion because she was convinced that religion was a source of women's subordination. In one of her speeches, she stated, "You may go over the world and you will find that every form of religion that has breathed upon this earth has degraded women." She also said men wrote scripture to suit their own interest. She also announced a project to reinterpret the Bible from the perspective of women. In the beginning of my presentation, I told you about Frederick Douglass, a former slave, and Susan B. Anthony, and how they were two very critical people to the AERA. While they were both fighting for equal rights for all Americans, they were both thinking that their own personal rights should happen first. Frederick ended up working with some people who made the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote. The National Women's Suffrage Association used their freedom to petition the government and oppose this amendment because it excluded women. They sent a voting rights petition to the Senate and House of Representatives, requesting that suffrage rights be extended to women and that women be granted the privilege of being heard on the floor of Congress. And lastly, there was a huge role that the press played, using their First Amendment right. EIU, a historical education website, says that the fight for suffrage was an important movement for women, and the press proved valuable to the cause. Journalists wrote in support of suffrage and against it. Various newspapers and journals were created in the struggle for rights. These publications strove to inform and to motivate and are lasting testimony to those who spoke out for equality.